In 2009, at a plastic surgeon's office in Osaka, Japan, a man walked in for an appointment to arrange a nose job. And it's a very routinely done surgery for this doctor. He's done it thousands of times before, but he noticed something very unusual about his patient's face. This encounter would help police end a 2.5-year search for a Japanese man who brutally murdered his English teacher, Lindsay Ann Hawker. Hi, my name's Yasmin, and I tell stories about topics that are scary, disturbing, or true crime. So if you'd like to, please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll get on with the rest of the story. In 2006, 22-year-old Lindsay Ann Hawker finally finished her biology major at Leeds University, graduating with first-class honours. And in October of that year, she wanted to make the move from her home in the UK over to Tokyo, Japan, to start to teach English at a school called Nova. So Nova is one of the largest English conversation schools in Japan, so it's very well known and it's a very secure job. And she only really wanted to do this for like a year or two before returning back to the UK to further her education. Plus, Lindsay was very close with her parents and her sisters and didn't really want to move away permanently from them. Her family did worry a little bit about her just because it was her first time moving over to a foreign country all on her own, but Lindsay was super passionate about her move, and it was something that she really wanted to do for quite a long time. She always made sure to contact her friends and family at least once a day, and that was either through Skype, phone, or email, and it just reduced everyone's anxiety a little bit. It was also reassuring that when she moved to Japan, she would be flatting with 2 other females, and these 2 females were also foreign English tutors as well. So it was really quite a safe environment. Plus, Japan is one of the safest countries in the world to travel to. So it was actually all fine. One day, Lindsay had finished work and she was on the train that afternoon and she was coming home when someone she didn't recognize just struck up a conversation with her, just this friendly conversation. And this person's name was Tatsuya Ichihashi, and he was 28 years old. He was Japanese, and he told Lindsay that he was actually one of her English students. But Lindsay felt a little bit bad because she didn't actually recognize him, but this could have been because she had so many students and she just sort of overlooked Tatsuya, so she didn't really think anything of it at this point. They had a friendly conversation on the train. It was very sort of surface level conversation, and once Lindsay got to her stop, she said goodbye, hopped on her bike, and just cycled a short distance over to her apartment. A few hours after coming home, there was a knock on her apartment door, and this was very strange because neither her nor her flatmates were expecting any visitors at this time. Lindsay cautiously cracked the door open to see who on earth it could be at this time, and to her surprise, it was the guy from the train. It was Tatsuya, and he was asking to come in for a glass of water, which was a little bit weird because Tatsuya had no idea where Lindsay lived unless he followed her home. But she shrugged off this weird feeling that she was getting because she kind of felt bad for him. Lindsay felt pretty safe letting him in the house because her 2 flatmates were still at home and they could just suss him out and see whether he was actually a little bit dodgy or whether she was just overthinking things. And at the apartment, Tatsuya acted very awkward. He took a seat at the dining table they had, and he seemed to be doodling on a piece of paper that he pulled out of his bag. He slowly sipped at the water and asked Lindsay whether she would be interested in a private English lesson. Lindsay had never really done like a one-on-one lesson. She did like classroom lessons for this big company, so it wasn't something that she was used to, but it also meant that she would be getting extra money, I guess. She felt like it was a little bit appropriate to do the lesson in a private setting, so instead she asked him as to whether he would be willing to meet at a cafe, and Tatsuya said, yeah, of course, that's fine, like not a problem. And they settled that in 4 days' time they would meet at this cafe in the morning for their first English lesson. Tatsuya thanked her for the water and he left the apartment. Lindsay noticed that he also left that piece of paper that he was doodling on the whole time. He just left it on the table face down. So, of course, after he left, she went back to the paper and flipped it over to see what he was even scribbling down. Turns out he was drawing a sketch of Lindsay's face. He also wrote his full name, email address, and phone number on the piece of paper. This is the second thing that struck Lindsay as being pretty odd, something again that she just sort of shrugged off, I guess. A few days later, they met up for coffee at around 10 a.m. for their first private English lesson, which seemed to go very well. Tatsuya conveniently, though, forgot to bring cash, so after the lesson, he told Lindsay that he needs to actually pack up and go back to his apartment to go and get the cash. After finishing the lesson, they packed up their belongings and they caught a taxi over to Tatsuya's apartment. Lindsay advised the taxi driver that she was only going to be a few minutes and for them to just wait for her downstairs because she didn't want to call another taxi and faff around with all of that. So she went up, but she was taking more than 5 minutes and the taxi driver was getting a little bit antsy, so he actually just drove off. So what was actually taking so long? Well, shortly after Lindsay entered the apartment, Tatsuya attacked her and he assaulted her. She started to scream and scream, but to muffle her screams, Tatsuya actually wrapped his hands around her neck and accidentally strangled her to death. The next door neighbors could hear these weird sounds coming from Tatsuya's apartment, and it was mainly metal screeching along the floor and this dull dragging noise. And this was actually the sound of Tatsuya dismantling his bathtub from the bathroom and dragging it all the way out to his balcony. And you can probably guess what for. So he made 6 separate trips to the hardware store in preparation for this moment, where he dragged Lindsay's body into the bathtub and he poured compost soil and a mixture of sand over her body to bury it in an attempt to start the decomposition process a little bit faster. So his goal was to start her body decomposing so that he could dispose of the body later on without it being suspicious. Well, turns out it's pretty suspicious to have a bathtub sitting on your balcony filled with soil, not to mention a human hand sticking out of that soil. Lindsay's family couldn't get in contact with her, which was totally out of character. Plus, she didn't turn up to work for 2 consecutive days, which again is something that Lindsay wouldn't do without calling in sick. And her flatmates hadn't seen her, and of course the last person who had seen her was Tatsuya, because her flatmates knew that she was actually meeting up with him for that one-on-one English lesson. Because of the weird antisocial behavior as well that he displayed at their house, like it was all just sounding a little bit too suspicious. So I guess you're thinking, who actually is Tatsuya? Well, he wasn't a student of Lindsay's, nor did he attend the English conversation school, surprise, surprise. He was also a 28-year-old man who lived by himself, and his parents funded his life, basically. His mum was a dentist and his dad was a medical doctor, and they would give him a monthly allowance so that he could get by and hopefully at some stage sort his life out. He did actually have a university degree that was from University of Chiba, and he majored in horticulture, but he never actually ended up using this degree. Police were able to profile him as a loner who the main thing he did was just go to the gym obsessively, and he'd bike at least 25 kilometers every single day. And all this information, coupled with the fact that he acted so weirdly around Lindsay when he made that visit over to her apartment, made the police quite suspicious, so they wanted to look into him a little bit more. Police officers did arrive at the apartment, and at the time they couldn't actually break in because they didn't have a search warrant or anything, because there was no solid evidence that he'd done anything wrong. So instead they just waited outside his apartment. All his lights were switched off, but it sounded like someone may have been inside because they could hear like rustling and sounds coming from in there. Tatsuya knew that he would have to leave the apartment eventually, and he couldn't just stay in the house. So what he did was he popped on a backpack and he bolted out the front door with no shoes on. Somehow he outran all the police, and this was the last time police would get a glimpse of him for the next 2.5 years. Wanted posters were hung up everywhere, like countrywide kind of thing. Even this like life-sized cutout of Tatsuya's body was placed in public locations just to attract the public's attention so that if anyone saw him, they could notify the police. But nothing. Nobody saw him for 2.5 years. In 2009, though, at a cosmetic surgery practice in Osaka, a patient had a pre-operative appointment for a nose job that he'd lined up. So this was a very commonly done surgery for this doctor, and he noticed that there was something really wrong with this patient's face, particularly his nose. When he got closer to his nose, he could see that this person had already had work done to their nose, but not by any sort of professional. It looked more like this person had used a needle and a thread and sort of did this home job nose surgery himself. Nevertheless, the surgeon agreed to do the surgery, and he took before and after photos. And at around this time, police had just happened to increase the cash reward for anyone who could provide any information on Tatsuya Ichihashi from 1 million Japanese yen to 10 million Japanese yen. And this really caught the eye of the surgeon, who realized that the before pictures he'd taken of his client looked extremely similar to the photos of the missing person that the police had just released. So he contacted the police, and of course it was confirmed that this client was in fact Tatsuya Ichihashi. Tatsuya was working at a construction site at the time, and some of his colleagues were also growing a little bit suspicious after the police released these photos of him. So Tatsuya got this like weird feeling, and he was like, no, I need to get out of here. So he made his last attempt to flee. He took off to go to a ferry terminal in Osaka as a last attempt to get off Japanese main island and head over to Okinawa, which is where he wanted to camp out in this like concrete bunker type thing all by himself. But he was too late. Police arrested him at the ferry terminal. Tatsuya was able to dodge any public identification to avoid police for 2.5 years because he performed multiple surgeries to his face to mutilate it. So the main one being the nose job, he actually physically moved his nose higher on his face with a needle and a thread. He also removed 2 moles on his cheek, and another thing he did was he sort of got this like scalpel and he removed a chunk of his lower lip to make his lip thinner. I'm not sure if he did it to the top lip as well, but he made his lips thinner nonetheless. He also was working at that construction company so that this could fund all the professional surgeries that he got done as well. Some of them being adding an extra fold to his eyelids and also arranging that nose job so that he could sort of fix what he already tried to do. I don't really know why Tatsuya thought this was appropriate, but he actually ended up publishing a book. And this book was called Until I Was Arrested, and it was basically about how he was on the run for 2.5 years, and he expressed how sorry he was to the family of Lindsay, and he declared that all the royalties from this book would go to Lindsay's family, which they declined, of course. But the book actually ended up doing all right. He sold about 100,000 copies of this thing. The trial took place, and Tatsuya was adamant that the murder wasn't intentional, and he conveyed how sorry he was to Lindsay's family over and over again for taking Lindsay's life. But regardless, he ruined everything about their family. Their lives changed forever. And the family wanted Tatsuya to have the maximum punishment available, which in Japan is the death penalty by hanging. But there's a very specific criteria you need to meet to be allowed to get the death penalty in Japan. And one of them is the fact that the murderer has to be a serial killer and have previous convictions, none of which Tatsuya had. The judge also knew that Tatsuya was young and that there was possibly a chance that he could be rehabilitated, so instead he was sentenced to life in prison. If you found this topic interesting, then please subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. I make new videos every single week, so I will see you in next week's video. Bye.